Nigerians from all walks of life have been expressing diverse shades of opinion on the performance of President Bola Tinubu, who is set to mark a second anniversary in office on May the 29th, 2025, in exactly 4 days from now. Criticism from the opposition side of the nation's democratic space has been particularly strong, perhaps owing to recent developments in the polity, notably the widespread defection of politicians from various political parties into the ruling APC. Those who are pushing this position are convinced that there is a tendency towards the acquisition of absolute power by President Tinubu, which they say may not augur well for Nigeria in the long run. Well, we'll now have a conversation with Managing Director, CEO, Cowry Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, on the state of the economy under Tinubu in the last 2 years. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.
Good afternoon, Chukwu, and thank you for having me.
So how would you assess the overall performance of the President's economic policies in the last 2 years?
Well, if I have to appraise the President's economic policies, I have to look at the performance of the economy generally. And you have to look at what rate was the economy growing, what was inflation rate, what was exchange rate. And I think if you look at the growth of the economy, last year the economy grew at 3.4% average. The preceding year it grew at 2.79%. But the preceding 2 years prior to the assumption of office of the president, in 2021, the economy grew at 3.4%, exactly what it grew last year. And in 2022, it grew at 3.1%. So if you compare the last 2 years of President Buhari's government to the first 2 years of President Tinubu's government, you will actually observe that the economy actually underperformed in the first 2 years of President Tinubu's government. I mean, if you compare the two preceding years and the two current years. But the other parameters you mentioned, the economy, are the macroeconomic stability or variables. You look at inflation rate. Last year, inflation rate averaged 32.18%. You look at the exchange rate saw a major depreciation at all the market windows. But having said that, I will also admit that the president took some bold economic measures, economic steps, such as harmonizing the exchange rate and removing the fuel subsidy, the subsidy on petroleum products, as well as removing the subsidy on electricity supply or electricity consumption. Those are both steps that the president took, which we must recognize. But on average, one will say that the intended positive impact are yet to manifest. Average households have seen a worsening of their standard of living. The macroeconomic stability we expect that should achieve has not happened. The growth in the GDP we expect that should happen has not happened. So all these things are still what we expect to happen in the immediate future, in the near future. But as we speak today, the first 2 years appraisal is that the economic environment deteriorated, particularly to most average households.
Now, you talked about some bold steps taken by the president, but we know that has led to an increase in inflation rate and, of course, the cost of living. So what measures do you think the government, can implement to mitigate the impact of inflation on low-income earners and the vulnerable? Well, I think one of the things that hurt the most low-income earners and the most vulnerable in the society is the cost of food or the price of food. And I think the emphasis should be, how do we improve food production? And I think it's no brainer that the major challenge we have with food production is issues around insecurity in the major food base of the country. And unfortunately, in the past couple of months, that seems to have worsened. We've seen a lot of displacement of farmers in Benue State, in Plateau State, and which is manifested in the inflation figure for the month of April. We saw that Benue State, which used to be the food basket of the country, had the highest food inflation, about 54%, contrary to the past when we used to go to Benue to buy food. So the first thing the government should do is deal with the issue of insecurity, particularly in the northern regions of the country. And then that will bring down the cost of food. The aspect that hurts most households is the cost of food. And if you even look at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the food basket, food and non-alcoholic beverages account for about 40% of average household consumption. So if we deal with the issue of insecurity, we're going to deal with the issue of food production, and which will lead to some level of relief for most households in the event that food prices come down.
But can you tell us, your own understanding of what the government's plan to stabilize prices and ensure food security is? Is there really a plan, that makes you confident that probably Nigeria will be out of the woods in no distant future?
Well, what I have is, what is very obvious is some palliative that the government has put in place, which includes importation of food, allowing for importation of food. That clearly is a temporary measure. It has some level of relief. It has created some level of relief, which was also manifested in the food index in the April CPI, where food inflation was about 21.26%, lower than the core inflation. So the importation of food has had some effect on bringing down the prices of food items. But having said that, we are talking about a long-term measure. I think the long-term measure, the most important long-term measure is to address the issue of insecurity. Then following that, you can also address the issue of irrigation. I think there was a vote. I saw something in the papers that some regions are saying that they were excluded from the votes for irrigation. So government needs to ensure that we have all-season farming. Take, for instance, rice is cultivated in the country. We can actually cultivate both upland rice and paddy rice. And because you can cultivate both seasons if you can irrigate the farmland. And that will obviously double the productivity of cultivated land in the country. So that's the next phase. But let's even start from the low-hanging fruit, which is address the issue of insecurity so that farmers can go back to their farmland and cultivate the farms and produce enough food. In the past, some 10, 15 years ago, we never thought of that Nigeria will suffer from food insecurity because we could produce enough food to feed ourselves. We can still do that if only farmers can go back to their farms.
So how has this administration's economic policy influenced the nation's infrastructure development and the investment climate?
Okay, what I would say in terms of infrastructure supply, I saw a report card that was obviously prepared by the government where they talked about the number of infrastructure they are building. They talked about the coastal road that is going to run from Lagos to Calabar, and they said they have built about 30 kilometers of that. So that's as our supply of infrastructure, particularly transport and road infrastructure. Apart from that, the others seem to be work in progress. Then you look at what are those critical infrastructure that are important for us to create a productive economy in this country. You need to look at power infrastructure. So I understand we are producing about 11 gigawatts of power, but we can only wheel out about 5 gigawatts of power, which is far below the demand. The government has increased tariff. We need to address the issue of, what do you call it, beyond the distribution network of power, we have to deal with the issue of transmission network, which seems very epileptic, and that's why we keep having a national grid collapse. So there must be investment that go into that, because without energy supply or power supply, you're not going to become a productive economy. That is very critical. The other critical investment, infrastructure investment, will include issues on the rail lines. I'm not sure the government is talking about the rail lines, but what we must give government credit is that in terms of the road network, there have been some improvement in the road network. There have been some level of maintenance and repairs on some federal highways, which we must give them credit for. So, but we need to expand that to other critical infrastructure, most importantly, power infrastructure, rail infrastructure, the seaports. I'm not also aware that anything is going on seriously on the seaport. I understand some contracts we're giving out. We need to see Nigeria develop deep seaports that will allow for efficient importation or discharge of goods into our shores, and as well as export of goods from our shores.
Now, Mr. Chukwu, I'd like us to go to the issue of revenue generation. How has this administration's strategy impacted the nation's finances, particularly with regards to the Federation Account Allocation Committee?
Well, interestingly, that has is one area the government seemed to have gained some grounds. Of course, the harmonizing of the exchange rate and the removal of subsidy led to a major uptick in the allocated revenue that goes to the three tiers of government. And that's why if you look at the amount the three tiers of government shared last year, over 14 trillion was shared last year, more than 50% or close to 50% above what they shared the preceding year. So we've seen an enhancement in revenues going to the government. But beyond that, we've also seen a strengthening of the revenue collection arms of government, the Federal Inland Revenue Service. But on the negative, we also seen an increase in the incidence of taxes or the burden of taxation on the few corporates that are in positions to pay. I mean, somebody reported to me today that the signage that is the cost of signage payment for gas stations has been moved from about 75,000 naira to 1,500 naira to 1.5 million per gas station, that is filling station. And that will be very stiff on those retail outlets because it's not as if their profit has increased, so you cannot increase the amount they pay because the filling station is here and I put a signage that so and so filling station is here, and you charge them, you move the amount they pay for signage from 75,000 naira to 1.5 million naira. So we have also seen incidences of overtaxation of a few corporates that are still surviving.
Now, you said they seem to be doing well in the area of revenue generation, but then what are the priorities for allocating increased revenues, and how is it being used to support economic development and social welfare programs?
You know, the three tiers of government are the one that gets the federation accounts shared to them. And each of the three types of government is relatively autonomous. So if we're discussing of how the federal government allocates its revenue, then we're looking at the federal government budget and the implementation of those budgets. As it relates to that, you realize that a large chunk of federal government expenditure is going to overhead because the federal government is still running a very huge deficit budgeting system. So in terms of allocation of resources, the proportion that goes when you talk of full implementation that goes to infrastructure is still infinitesimally small. At the state government levels, it depends on which government you are talking of. Some government has proven to be good at effectively allocating their resources. A case in point is the case of Abia State, which is now almost being celebrated across the country in terms of the level of infrastructure that have been built in Abia State in just less than 2 years. I think another state that's actually coming up strongly in terms of effective utilization of economic resources is the Enugu State. So it depends on which state. But the key thing we must bear in mind is that we as citizens must continue to push the government to ensure that we get value for money in terms of whatever resources that are accruable to the government.
But, overall, what steps would you advocate should be taken to ensure transparency and accountability in revenue allocation?
Well, that will come from the arm of the government that is actually in charge of oversight function. Of course, there are three levels to it. You have the primary responsibility of the National Assembly to oversight budgetary implementation, to oversight revenue allocation. You also have the role of opposition political parties. I think Professor Tommy said he's going to set up a shadow government, to obviously to shadow, when you talk of shadow, to shadow government activities, and that will mean that they will criticize government expenditure and government revenue. And probably that will provide to the public a lot more information on how revenues of government are effectively allocated. Then you have the civil society group. You have the likes of Budget IT that came up with information on the pattern of federal government 2025 budget. So you also expect the civil society groups to pressure the government to use the freedom of information to extract information on how government is deploying our economic resources and push and campaign that government is efficient in the deployment of economic resources.
I'd like us to focus a bit on the private sector. How well has it fared under this administration, and what role can private sector investment play in driving economic progress? Well,
to me, I think the private sector has actually gone through a very difficult period, because when I looked at the full year GDP performance, and I looked at the major sectors of the economy, for instance, agricultural sector, that account for about 26% of the GDP, it grew by only 1.19%. That's a chunk of the private sector engagement. The next is ICT, that account about 18% of the GDP. It grew about 5.4%. And we have seen consistent decline in ICT. Good thing, the government recently increased the tariff that is payable for the service of the ICT companies, and that will help them improve their growth rate or at least lead to further investment. Then you look at the next sector, trade sector. Trade sector, which accounts for about 16% of the GDP, grew by only 0.9%. You drill down further, the manufacturing sector, which accounts for about 9% of the GDP, it grew about only 1.38%. And the only one that grew sufficiently strong was the financial service sector, that grew about 15%. But going down the pecking order, and you go to areas that we think should drive the future of the country, arts, entertainment, where the youths are actually very strong, you saw that contracted by over 48% last year. So the private sector as a component of the economic operators in Nigeria, I would say that the past 1 or 2 years have been a difficult period, dealing with inflation rate, dealing with huge depreciation of the local currency, with several operators locking in exchange losses in 2025, 2024 and 2023. So on a balance, one would say that the private sector is just trying to come out of a difficult economic environment that has led to some level of difficulties managing growth.
So what other sectors, can the government capitalize on and invest in to drive economic growth and development as we wrap up this discussion?
I will mention about 4 critical sectors. Some of them are short-term, some of them are medium-term. The first I had mentioned repeatedly, address the issue of insecurity, strengthen the armed forces. 2, address the issue of critical infrastructure. 3, address the issue of crude oil production. Is very critical for us to improve our crude oil production so as to improve our foreign exchange earnings, help stabilize our currency, and possibly lead to appreciation of local currency. And then 4 would be the issue of rule of law, where you have people don't have confidence in the rule of law, either because of political exigencies. The investors pull back in investing. Even local investors are cautious of the fact that they can't get issues, disputes resolved within the legal system if there are such issues involved. So I think those are the areas we should focus on. There are longer to medium-term issues we can address, the issue of quality of education, the curriculum of education, so as to make sure you prepare the quality of labor you need or the type of labor you need that will support a productive economy.
Mr. Johnson Chukwu, Managing Director, CEO, Cowry Assets Management Limited, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.